For Paul McCartney and George Harrison, the years following the breakup of the Beatles were some of the most complicated of their lives. The public often imagined that once the band ended, each member simply moved on to new projects and new successes. The reality was far more emotional. The wounds left behind by years of creative tension did not disappear overnight. Instead, they lingered beneath the surface, shaping the way Paul and George viewed one another for decades. When the Beatles officially came to an end in 1970, George Harrison emerged with something to prove. For years, he had lived in the shadow of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. Although he had contributed memorable songs to the Beatles' catalog, many of his compositions had been overlooked or pushed aside in favor of material written by Paul and John. The frustration had built quietly inside him. By the time the group dissolved, George had accumulated a remarkable collection of songs that had never received the attention he believed they deserved. That frustration became fuel. In late 1970, George released All Things Must Pass, a massive triple album that shocked critics and fans alike. The record was filled with songs that demonstrated a depth and maturity many listeners had never fully associated with him. Tracks such as My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, and Isn't It a Pity revealed a songwriter operating at the peak of his powers. The album quickly became a commercial and critical success, proving that George Harrison was much more than the quiet Beatle. For Paul McCartney, George's triumph was impossible to ignore. Although Paul publicly congratulated George, the success also served as a reminder that perhaps George had not been given enough room to grow during the Beatles' years. It was a realization that would take Paul many years to fully acknowledge. At the time, however, both men were focused on establishing their own identities outside the shadow of the world's most famous band. Paul formed Wings and threw himself into recording and touring. His relentless work ethic remained intact. If anything, the breakup only intensified his determination to succeed. Album after album followed. Hit singles climbed the charts. Stadiums filled with fans eager to see him perform. Yet despite the success, the Beatles were never entirely absent from his life. Every interview eventually returned to the same questions. What happened between the members? Would they ever reunite? Did he still speak to George? The answers were rarely simple. Throughout the 1970s, George often appeared more willing than Paul to discuss the tensions that had existed within the Beatles. He openly criticized aspects of the band's internal dynamics and frequently described Paul as controlling. In one interview, George remarked that while he could imagine playing music with John Lennon again, he could not imagine doing so with Paul. The statement attracted headlines around the world. For Paul, such comments were painful. Although he rarely responded publicly, friends later suggested that he was deeply hurt by George's words. After all, he had been the one who first recognized George's talent as a teenager. He had introduced him to John Lennon and helped secure his place in the Quarrymen. From Paul's perspective, their shared history should have counted for something. Yet George's resentment ran deep, and years of frustration could not be erased simply because the Beatles no longer existed. Despite these tensions, neither man completely severed ties with the other. Their lives continued to intersect through mutual friends, business matters, and occasional social encounters. There were moments when it seemed possible that they might fully reconcile. Then another disagreement would emerge, reopening old wounds. One of the most significant missed opportunities came in 1971. George organized the Concert for Bangladesh, a groundbreaking charity event that brought together some of the biggest names in music. It was a project that reflected his growing commitment to humanitarian causes. George hoped Paul would participate. Having a former Beatle on stage beside him would have carried enormous symbolic importance. Paul declined the invitation. His reasons were practical. There were concerns about organization, management issues, and the overall logistics of the event. Yet George interpreted the decision differently. To him, it felt like another sign that Paul was unwilling to support him fully. The absence widened the distance between them and reinforced the belief that their friendship would never again resemble what it had been in their youth. As the decade progressed, both men continued moving in different directions. George became increasingly devoted to spirituality. Meditation, Hindu philosophy, and personal reflection occupied much of his attention. Fame interested him less than it once had. He preferred a quieter existence, focusing on family, gardening, and projects that held personal meaning. Paul remained driven by performance and creation. Touring, recording, and experimenting with new musical ideas kept him constantly busy. Where George sought peace and detachment, Paul sought movement and momentum. Their differences, which had once created tension within the Beatles, became even more pronounced in their solo careers. Yet time has a way of softening even the deepest conflicts. The assassination of John Lennon in December 1980 profoundly affected both men. Although they processed the tragedy differently, it forced them to confront the reality that life was finite. Suddenly, old arguments seemed less important than they once had. The loss of John created a shared grief that neither Paul nor George could fully escape. In the years that followed, their interactions became less hostile. They were never inseparable friends again, but the sharp edge of their resentment gradually faded. Age brought perspective. Experiences that had once seemed unforgivable began to appear in a different light. By the early 1990s, circumstances created an opportunity neither man had expected. Work began on what would become the Beatles' anthology project. The undertaking required surviving members of the band to come together and revisit their extraordinary history. For fans, it was a dream. For Paul and George, it was a challenge. Memories resurfaced. Old disagreements were discussed. Long-buried emotions returned. Yet something else happened as well. Both men began to recognize how much they had shared. Very few people could understand what it felt like to experience Beatlemania from the inside. Only Paul, George, and Ringo truly knew what those years had been like. In February 1994, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr reunited in McCartney's studio to work on unfinished recordings left behind by John Lennon. The sessions generated enormous excitement around the world. Newspapers referred to them as the Three Tools. Fans who had long accepted that the Beatles would never reunite suddenly found themselves witnessing something remarkably close. The experience was not always smooth. George arrived with strong opinions about how the recordings should be handled. He insisted that Jeff Lynne serve as producer, believing an outside figure was necessary to prevent old rivalries from resurfacing. His concern was understandable. Decades had passed, but the personalities remained largely unchanged. Paul still possessed the same perfectionist tendencies that had frustrated George during the Beatles' years. George still resisted being told what to do. Discussions about arrangements, instrumentation, and production occasionally became heated. Yet unlike the late 1960s, there was now a greater willingness to compromise. The resulting songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love, became more than recordings. They were symbols of reconciliation. Imperfect though their relationship remained, Paul and George had found a way to work together again. The process reminded them of what had first connected them as teenagers on a Liverpool bus, a shared love of music. Outside the studio, Paul began speaking more openly about George's talents. For years he had referred to him as a late bloomer. Now he acknowledged that George had become one of the greatest songwriters of his generation. It was praise that would have been difficult for Paul to offer during the competitive atmosphere of the Beatles' years. George appreciated the recognition, though he rarely expressed sentimentality. He remained characteristically honest about the past. If he believed Paul had been overbearing, he said so. If he felt certain decisions had been unfair, he admitted it. Yet there was less anger in his voice than before. Unfortunately, just as their relationship appeared to be stabilizing, George's health began to deteriorate. In 1997, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. The news alarmed friends and family members. George underwent treatment and initially appeared optimistic. However, additional health problems followed in the years ahead. Lung cancer emerged. Later came a brain tumor. Each diagnosis presented a new challenge. Then, in December 1999, George experienced a terrifying ordeal when an intruder broke into his home at Friar Park and attacked him with a knife. The assault left him seriously injured. Although he survived, the incident further weakened him physically and emotionally. Throughout these difficult years, Paul remained in contact. The history between them was too significant to ignore. Whatever disagreements had existed, they had known one another for nearly half a century. Their lives had become intertwined long before fame arrived. As George's condition worsened, Paul visited whenever possible. Conversations that might once have been dominated by arguments now focused on memories, family, and friendship. The passage of time had stripped away much of the ego that had fueled earlier conflicts. One of their final meetings took place in a hospital in New York. Paul later described sitting beside George for hours as they talked and laughed together. The atmosphere felt strangely familiar. For a moment, it was as though they had been transported back to their youth. They joked about absurd things. They reminisced. They shared stories. At one point, they even held hands. To outsiders, the gesture might have seemed small. To Paul, it meant everything. The emotional barriers that had once separated them no longer mattered. When George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, the news sent shock waves around the world. Millions mourned the loss of one of music's most influential figures. But for Paul McCartney, the grief was intensely personal. He had not simply lost a former bandmate. He had lost someone who had been present during nearly every important chapter of his life. George had been there before fame. He had been there during Beatlemania. He had been there through triumphs, failures, arguments, and reconciliations. Their relationship had survived extraordinary pressures that would have destroyed many friendships. Though imperfect, it had endured. In the years after George's death, Paul frequently reflected on what their friendship had meant. He spoke warmly of George's humor, intelligence, and spirituality. He admitted that he had underestimated him at times. He acknowledged mistakes he had made. Most importantly, he emphasized the love that had existed beneath all the conflict. One story became especially meaningful to him. Years earlier, George had given Paul a tree as a gift. Paul planted it near his home and watched it grow over time. After George's passing, the tree took on new significance. Whenever he walked by it, he would quietly greet his old friend. "Hi, George," he would say. The gesture reflected something profound. Relationships are rarely defined solely by their conflicts. The arguments between Paul and George were real. So were the frustrations, disappointments, and misunderstandings. Yet those things represented only part of the story. The deeper truth was that they had loved one another like brothers. Brothers compete. Brothers argue. Brothers drift apart. But family bonds often survive even the most difficult periods. That was ultimately the story of Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Their friendship began on school bus rides through Liverpool and carried them to heights neither could have imagined. Together they helped create music that transformed popular culture forever. Along the way they hurt each other, challenged each other, and pushed each other to grow. In the end, however, what remained was not bitterness. It was respect. It was affection. It was gratitude. And perhaps that is why Paul's words after George's death continue to resonate so deeply. Beneath the fame, beneath the history, beneath the endless debates about the Beatles and their legacy, Paul saw George in the simplest possible way. Not as a rival, not as a former bandmate, not as a legendary musician, but as his little brother. And that bond, forged decades earlier in Liverpool, proved stronger than fame, stronger than conflict, and even stronger than death itself. In the years following George Harrison's death, Paul McCartney discovered something unexpected. The passage of time did not weaken George's presence in his life. If anything, it made certain memories even stronger. The arguments that had once seemed so important gradually faded into the background, while the moments of friendship remained vivid. Paul often found himself thinking not about recording sessions of business disputes, but about two teenagers from Liverpool sharing guitars, swapping records, and dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. For the public, the story of Paul and George was often reduced to a simple narrative of rivalry. Headlines focused on clashes, disagreements, and creative battles. Yet those who knew them understood that the truth was far more complicated. Their relationship had lasted nearly 50 years. No friendship survives that long without experiencing periods of tension, disappointment, and reconciliation. As Paul entered his 60s and 70s, he became increasingly reflective about the Beatles era. Interviews that once might have frustrated him now became opportunities to revisit the past. Again and again, he found himself speaking about George. Sometimes he recalled funny stories. Other times he spoke with visible emotion about the friend he had lost. One memory in particular remained important. Paul often described the first time he truly recognized George's determination as a musician. Even as a teenager, George possessed a focus that set him apart. While other boys his age were distracted by countless interests, George seemed completely absorbed by the guitar. He practiced constantly. He studied every note he could hear on American rock and roll records. He approached music not simply as entertainment, but as something essential. Looking back, Paul admitted that George's dedication had been extraordinary. The younger boy who had once needed help getting into the band eventually developed into one of the most respected songwriters in the world. That transformation impressed Paul more with each passing year. Fans often debated whether George had been treated fairly within the Beatles. The discussion became part of music history. Many argued that his talent had been overshadowed by the dominance of Lennon and McCartney. Others believed the competitive environment ultimately pushed George to become a stronger writer. Paul himself seemed to wrestle with the question. In later interviews, he acknowledged that George's songs deserved greater recognition than they sometimes received during the Beatles' years. He openly praised compositions such as Something, Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and All Things Must Pass. What had once been difficult for him to admit now seemed obvious. The irony was impossible to ignore. During the Beatles' final years, George had fought desperately for more space. After his death, even his former rivals spoke of him with admiration. Time had confirmed what George had always believed. He belonged among the greatest songwriters of his generation. Meanwhile, George's legacy continued to grow. New generations discovered his music through streaming services, documentaries, and reissues of classic albums. Young listeners who had never experienced Beatlemania became fascinated by his unique perspective. Unlike many rock stars, George often seemed uncomfortable with fame. His songs explored spirituality, self-discovery, and the search for meaning beyond material success. That quality distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. While the world celebrated celebrity culture, George frequently questioned it. He understood the power of fame because he had experienced it at a level few people could comprehend. Yet he also understood its limitations. Paul admired that aspect of George, even if he had not always shared it. The two men approached life differently. Paul remained energized by performing, creating, and engaging with audiences. George often preferred privacy and reflection. These contrasting personalities had created tension within the Beatles, but they also contributed to the band's extraordinary balance. Without Paul's drive, the Beatles might never have achieved such remarkable success. Without George's perspective, they might never have evolved beyond a conventional pop group. Together, their differences became strengths. This realization became increasingly clear as historians, biographers, and musicians continued examining the Beatles' story. Every new documentary seemed to reveal additional layers of complexity. Viewers saw moments of conflict, but they also witnessed moments of affection. A joke shared between songs, a smile exchanged during rehearsal, a quiet glance that reflected years of understanding. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in footage from the band's early years. Before the pressures of global fame, Paul and George often appeared inseparable. They traveled together, rehearsed together, and spent countless hours discussing music. Success eventually complicated those relationships, but it never completely erased the foundation upon which they had been built. For George's family, maintaining connections with Paul's family became an important part of preserving that legacy. George's son, Donnie Harrison, developed a close relationship with many people who had known his father. Like George, Donnie possessed a deep love of music. He frequently participated in projects that celebrated his father's work and ensured that new audiences could appreciate it. Paul's daughter Stella McCartney also remained connected to the Harrison family. Their friendship symbolized something meaningful. The next generation inherited not the conflicts that had once divided their fathers, but the respect and affection that ultimately endured. This continuation of friendship would likely have pleased George. Despite his reputation for blunt honesty, he cared deeply about loyalty and personal connection. Beneath his occasionally sharp comments about the Beatles' years was a man who valued relationships enormously. As anniversaries of George's birth and death came and went, Paul often participated in tributes honoring him. Whether through concerts, interviews, or public statements, he consistently emphasized George's importance. Not just as a Beatle, but as a human being. One tribute stood out above many others. During performances of Something, Paul sometimes played a ukulele at the beginning of the song. He explained that George had loved the instrument and often carried one with him. The gesture was simple, yet deeply moving. Each performance became a conversation across time, a way for Paul to acknowledge the friend who was no longer physically present. Audiences responded emotionally because they understood what the moment represented. It was not merely a musical tribute. It was an expression of friendship. As years turned into decades, the mythology surrounding the Beatles continued to grow. Books were written, films were produced, scholars analyzed recordings and interviews. Every detail of the band's history seemed worthy of examination. Yet for all the analysis, some truths remained remarkably simple. Paul McCartney and George Harrison met as schoolboys. They shared a passion for music. They helped change the world. They argued. They reconciled. They grew older. And eventually one of them was left behind to remember. That final reality may be the most heartbreaking aspect of their story. Paul became the keeper of countless memories that could no longer be shared with George. Every anniversary, every documentary, every rediscovered photograph carried a reminder of absence. Still, Paul rarely spoke about George with bitterness. Instead, he focused on gratitude. He understood how fortunate they had been to experience such an extraordinary journey together. Few friendships produce memories that influence generations of people around the world. When asked about George in later years, Paul often returned to the same themes: humor, kindness, intelligence, musical brilliance. He described George as someone who possessed a sharp wit and a unique way of seeing the world. Even during difficult periods, those qualities never disappeared. The public sometimes forgets that the Beatles were incredibly young when fame arrived. They navigated pressures that would challenge even experienced adults. Mistakes were inevitable. Misunderstandings were unavoidable. Viewed through that lens, the survival of any friendship seems remarkable. The survival of Paul and George's friendship is perhaps even more remarkable. They endured unimaginable scrutiny. They experienced extraordinary success. They competed professionally. They suffered personal tragedies. And somehow, despite everything, they remained connected. Their story also offers a lesson about recognition. Throughout much of his life, George felt underestimated. He struggled to convince others that his contributions mattered as much as those of his more celebrated bandmates. Yet history eventually corrected that perception. Today, George Harrison is widely regarded as one of the greatest songwriters in rock history. Songs that once competed for space on Beatles albums are now considered classics. Critics regularly place his work alongside that of Lennon and McCartney. The validation he sought finally arrived. For Paul, acknowledging that reality became an important part of honoring George's memory. Rather than defending old hierarchies, he embraced the truth that George had become an artistic equal. It was a recognition rooted not in obligation, but in genuine admiration. In many ways, their relationship completed a full circle. As teenagers, Paul had been the mentor introducing George to opportunities. As adults, George emerged as an artist worthy of equal respect. By the end of their lives, neither role mattered very much. What mattered was the friendship itself, the memories, the shared experiences, the laughter, the music, and the understanding that no one else could fully comprehend what they had lived through together. That understanding remained with Paul long after George was gone. Every performance of a Beatles song carried echoes of the past. Every mention of Liverpool brought memories rushing back. Every familiar melody served as a reminder of the friend who had once sat beside him, guitar in hand, imagining a future neither of them could possibly have predicted. For all the years of conflict, disappointment, and rivalry, that is the image that endured. Not George the celebrity, not George the former Beatle, not George the rival songwriter, but George the friend, The boy from Liverpool who climbed aboard a bus carrying dreams larger than anyone around him could see. The friend who helped create a musical revolution. The brother who remained part of Paul's life for nearly half a century. And the memory that never truly faded.